Let me welcome all of you to the Center for Global Development for this event, which is organized jointly with the World Bank. And in particular, I want to welcome our very distinguished guests, Nandan Nilekani. It's a pleasure to have you back with us again, Nandan. Commissioner Amani Abu Zaid from the African Union, and Christian Wolf Sondergaard from Telenor. So you will be hearing from all of them shortly, and the person who will make sure that they say what they have to say in the time that they have been allocated is going to be our own Caroline Atkinson, who, of course, is also a board member for CGD. Let me just say before turning it over that um, this whole topic of digital technology and its implications for development is very much part of our work agenda here at the center. Some of you may have been at a workshop we hosted yesterday with the Pathways for Prosperity Commission on how the development community can best support sound data governance in lower income countries. We have also convened an outstanding panel, in fact, on data governance yesterday, with a focus on the balance with economic development. And in parallel, we're sort of working on a related work stream, which is around the impact of robotization and AI on jobs and development strategies. And I see Susan Lund sitting there, which is a member of that particular working group, which Caroline and I have had the pleasure of chairing. And we've also, in this area of work, had a sort of history of good collaboration with the World Bank, including in the preparation of the principles for the use of ID systems, which is something now that quite widely applied. And obviously, as you will hear in all of this, what the technology offers is amplifies the opportunities, but also raises some of the risks in particular, the risks of exclusion for groups of people who may previously, in some sort of more nuanced way of identifying themselves, have been able to at least access certain things. And in all of this, India is a very special country in the present context because of the very rapid advances that have been made in all areas of digital application, sort of, and the massive application across a wide range of programs. It's like a laboratory for the world at the moment in this space, and therefore this is a very opportune event. So before handing over to Caroline, what I'd like to do is ask Vijayanti Desai of the World Bank and Alan Gelb, who's of course a senior fellow here and has been leading this work, to make a short presentation on the work that we have been doing, and then we will move on to hearing from our distinguished guests. So with that, let me turn it over to both of you. I need to hand this mic over to Alan, I'm told.
Good afternoon, and I'll try to keep my remarks short since I know everyone is here to listen to Nandan and the panel. We're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Center for Global Development. My name is Vijayanti Desai. I'm managing the World Bank Group's Identification for Development initiative and been recently tasked with a couple of additional topics on digitizing government-to-person payments and data governance for innovation and empowerment. And just as these priorities require a whole-of-government approach with our client countries, it also requires a similar whole-of-institution approach in an institution like ours. So World Bank Group has placed a tremendous priority on leveraging technologies to catalyze digital economy and improve our development outcomes. The WDR of 2016 on digital development provided a good framework on how digital impacts development by improving efficiency, inclusion, and innovation across people, firms, and governments. The Bank Group is engaging with a growing number of client countries at varying stages of their digital transformation across several regions, both individual countries, but also region-wide. Africa with the Digital Economy for Africa, supporting AU on the digital transformation, in MENA with MENA Tech, and several other regions. While connectivity is critical for digital economy, we also believe that the next layer of digital infrastructure identity, payments, data empowerment are key platforms to realize these development goals. We're also proactively focused on the responsible application of digital technologies, and this includes safeguarding people's rights, especially to data protection, and ensuring that digital technologies eliminate rather than exacerbate inequalities. Just a couple of things on each of those three, because it's the topic of today's discussion on what the World Bank Group is doing. So on digital identity, we estimate 1 billion people globally who are unable to prove who they are officially. This affects mostly people in lowest income economies, but not only in low income economies, but the poorest income quintiles. In low income countries, close to 1 in 2 people in the poorest income quintile are estimated to lack ID, compared to 1 in 4 in the richest income quintile. And on average, over 45% of women in low income countries lack ID, compared to 30% of men. And with an ID that is digitally enabled, the opportunities for financial inclusion, instant account opening, reducing leakage and increasing transparency, access to health, so many different development outcomes are possible. And with the support of Gates Foundation, Omidyar Network, who are here in this room, Australian government and UK, the ID4D initiative is now engaged with over 35 countries and working on a set of standards, norms, good practices, and principles. And on G2P, we know that it accelerates efficiency within its program, but also when done well and with a platform approach in mind, it can lead to broader goals of financial inclusion, increased fiscal savings, and women's empowerment. And digitizing payments, like for social assistance to the poorest, provides a pathway to financial inclusion in some of the most rural and last mile areas. The World Bank Group has a portfolio of $12 billion on social assistance programs alone, and a new cross-global practice effort across the institution is considering how to move across the single program efficiency to broader fiscal savings and inclusion. And then just lastly on data, we know how pervasive a role it's playing both for governments as well as private sector, and how data is being leveraged to make decisions to deliver services more effectively. But as part of this broader issue on data, and I think looking at not only the opportunities, but what we need to put in place on some of the horizontals of data governance, this is a new area that the Bank Group is looking to engage. And we'll hear from Nandan, and not just looking at data governance, but also how to leverage data to empower individuals who are in the poorest areas. And what we think is most powerful is the convergence of all of this, identity, payments, and data empowerment, which we'll hear Nandan talk about. So we're very lucky to have Nandan Nilekani, one of the visionaries behind Aadhaar and the India Stack, with us today. And personally, we're also very tremendously grateful for his invaluable voice and support to our ID4D efforts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rajhanti. Thank you, Masood. And thank you all for coming, especially our speakers. About 10 years ago, we began a research program on the applications of ID technology to development. And at that stage, it wasn't really a subject. I mean, nobody was thinking much about it. But I think now the baby has grown up, at least to a substantial degree. And it's a very active issue and topic. And our work widened, this is again with the support of the Gates Foundation, we must thank them, to include the combination of ID payments technology and, of course, mobile technology in terms of development, the relationship between using these technologies to build state capacity and also to create a variety of opportunities through the economy. And as we sort of conceptualize it, what they do is they expand the policy possibility set for a government. Government can do more and it can do it better, right? And there are more opportunities for people. But of course, first of all, this doesn't mean that governments will actually use these possibilities in a constructive way. Some may not, and some may not use them at all. And it doesn't mean that everybody will have access to them. I mean, if you're going to use them, they have to have very wide access, and we still see a lot of barriers for certain groups in the access to the services that these technologies facilitate. So we have a number of items on our website, and I think there may be some short pieces, handouts, so I won't go any further in terms of our work. Just to note that we see lots of areas of application. We've looked at a lot of case studies, including in India, which is a very interesting place for this, but also in other parts of the world. And there are some very new areas coming up, including the use of digital data to empower users through enabling them to give very rapid feedback on the quality of service. So there's some very new areas coming up which have barely made it into the development space. Now, India is not the first country to use these technologies. As far as I know, the first country to use these technologies in a developmental sense is South Africa, back in the mid-1990s in my home province of KwaZulu-Natal. And what they did there was they were delivering pensions using biometric smart cards linked to ATMs on the back of little trucks going around the country. And that was a very early application. But I think India is quite remarkable in a couple of ways. Firstly, it has had a vision which has extended out a very long way, and you're going to hear something about that vision today. And secondly, it has had a strategic approach to using these, which many other countries have not yet managed to do. So it is a very exceptional case, and I think we're very fortunate to have an opportunity to reflect on it and its lessons also for the wider development community. So thank you again. This meeting is really central to our work. And let me invite Caroline to take over. Caroline, all yours.
Oh yes. So thanks very much. Thanks, Masood, Alan, Vajanti. I will be brief because Nandan is, I can tell by the numbers of the people here, that very eager to hear from him as well as the other panel members. As we came in, I was congratulating him on his career, and he said to me, well, a bit haphazard. I think a better term is the one that you used, which was visionary. Nandan, of course, is the co-founder of Infosys and still its non-executive chairman. But I think we're all here because of the visionary way in which he used that expertise and that technical grounding in order to develop, as Alan said, a really strategic look at how the digital world and digital technologies could be used to help transform lives, make government more efficient, and promote inclusion. So he was the first chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India, which implemented the Aadhaar program that now covers 1.3 billion people. And he's headed the Indian government's technology committee and a recent high-level committee that the Reserve Bank of India constituted in order to promote financial inclusion. He's also a co-founder of EkStep, which is a not-for-profit initiative that is to promote digital learning universally. And of course, in his spare time, he wrote a couple of books. So, and I'm happy to give out the titles of those, but we all have Google, so we can also figure those out. So Nandan, thank you so much for coming to the center. Please come and give us your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you all, and does it have to?
It's over there.
Oh, it's not on this one. Okay, so you have to just. Okay, so I'll talk today about. Oh, okay, it's here. All right, great. So we're in good shape. So today my topic is really, I think, referred to by others earlier, is identity, payments, and data empowerment. And these are three big ideas which have evolved in India over the last 10 years. And I wanted to just put them in a strategic frame. And they all, one flows from the other, but they all add up to something fairly significant. And it all began. So we see, and we looked at it from the lens of financial inclusion. And how do we bring more people into the financial system? How do you keep them in the system so that they actually use what is there? And how do we allow them to use the data without compromising privacy. So these are the big three ideas that we had. And the first part of it was we had to solve the challenge of access. How do we get everybody into the financial system? And this is something which began with, if you go back and look at 2008, only 17% of Indians had bank accounts. So financial exclusion was rampant because people didn't have an ID. There was no simple way to do a KYC. The banks were not very keen to have customers who didn't leave a lot of money with them. So it was really a pretty excluded situation just about 10, 11 years back. Now, this has now dramatically changed, and we have seen what has happened in India over the last several years. Now, typically, India was at where it should have been based on GDP way back in 2011, but by 2018, India was up there, which means that in about 7-8 years, there was a huge increase in the number of people who were with a bank account and inside the financial system. And normally, this should have taken 46 years. And this is data from BIS, which has analyzed the connection between GDP per capita and financial inclusion. And where India is today would have taken 46 years, but thanks to the intervention that was done over the last decade, this has happened in 7 or 8 years. So that's the power of how a sort of combined approach can dramatically crunch the development and bring up something that would have taken 46 years to get it done in about 8 years. Now, why did this happen? It happened for 3 reasons. One, of course, the political will, which is most important in these things, and the belief that financial inclusion is very, very important for a country. And this, while it was there in previous governments too, it got an even bigger push with the current government, which came into power in 2014, when they launched something called the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana program. And also because we had a very proactive central bank, because financial inclusion requires a central bank because they regulate banks and so on. And finally, it happened because there was a technology capability to make this happen at scale. In other words, to get something like this to work, you need all three working in your favor. You need the political will and the political priorities being given to this activity. You need regulators who are open to change and open to doing something innovative, and you need technology. And that's one, to Alan's point about how do we do this everywhere else, one of the challenges is how do we get all these things, all these ducks in a row, and that's what we were fortunate that we had this in India. And we also had the advantage that over the last 10 years, while there have been changes in government, the commitment to these programs has remained, and therefore we've been able to navigate even when the governments changed. Now, India Stack is the technology part of this journey, and essentially it has 3 parts to it. The first is, which is the well-known part, which is the identity part, and that's the project which I led. I started this group in the government 10 years back. I joined the government, quit my job in the private sector, and worked in government for about 4.5 years. And essentially, it was a very simple goal, which was give every resident a unique ID. So the objective was just one line. So, but the challenge was how to make it happen. And by giving them this unique ID, it was enabled to them to prove I am whom I claim to be. So just about verification of identity online. And that led to a number of things. The second layer is something which was built later, which was how to create a state-of-the-art payment system. And this was not done by the government. This was done by another body called the National Payment Corporation of India, which is a company, a non-profit company owned by the banks. So the interesting thing was both the ID group in the government and the NPCI was set up at the same time. It was a sheer coincidence. It was not that anybody had some grand plan. But around the time that I moved to the government in 2009, the Reserve Bank of India decided that India needed a company to run its retail payments, and they set up the NPCI in the same time. So we had 2 startups in the system, and we got along very well. And a lot of this happened because the two groups worked together to create this capability. And sometime in 2013-14, we began to realize that the payment infrastructure had to be modernized with the arrival of smartphones and all these things. People would like to just pay on their devices, but we wanted to build an open, interoperable payment system which could not be captured by anyone. And therefore, the NPCI took up the project of developing a completely next generation payment system, which is called UPI. And I was an advisor. I'm still the advisor to the NPCI on payments, and my colleague Pramod, who's here, Pramod is the architect both of Aadhaar and of the UPI. And so payments was completely transformed in the last 4 to 5 years. And finally, as you can think of identity as something that enabled people to get access, right? So they could use the ID to get a bank account or whatever, and payments allowed them to engage and make things. But we realized that they are really transactional in nature. They allow transactions to happen. But we realized that all this digitization of identity and payments was actually creating a huge amount of digital footprints. And then we said, in a country where people are poor but are rich in data, can we have a thought where they can use that data to advance their lives? In other words, can they use their data to get better healthcare, better education, better jobs, and better loans? And that's what we call as data empowerment. And the third big idea which we developed over the last 2-3 years is the notion of how do we enable 1 billion people to use their own data. So these are all three big things that have evolved over the last 10 years. Identity for all, universal, low cost, high volume transactions in a very modern way, and a way to use your own data for your future. So these are three big things that we talk about. Now, it's important to realize that this was not done in a day. This was done in 10 years. And as this timeline will show you, that the first one that went off the block was identity, and the bulk of the work was done from 2009 to 2015. Then the payment infrastructure that NPCI put up took the next round, and then in the last 3-4 years, the whole business of data. And I think the message in this is that what Alan referred to is that you need to have a strategic architecture for doing these things. That while you may choose to do it tactically, in the sense at different points you have different tactics, there has to be an overall strategy. And I think by and large, because we had this overall strategy and because we were a constant in the system in some sense, we were able to actually make this happen. And so all these things are sort of made to work with each other. There are layers that work together and a lot of other things that are pretty interesting to think about. The first one, obviously, I said was identity, and that was the project that I took up. The challenge when I started was most people did not have an identity number or any piece of paper. Their births were not registered. Many Indian states, more than half the children born don't have a birth certificate. And in the old days, this was fine because you lived and spent all your life in the same village. It was like you went to the Cheers bar and everybody knew your name. So it was one of those things, and therefore everybody knew your name in the village. But as people started becoming more mobile, migrating, going from rural to urban, from north to south, from east to west, not having a way to prove who they were was becoming a huge impediment for security, to board a train, to get a job, to get a bank account. So fundamentally, ID had become an impediment. And that's why the government started this project. And the idea was to give everybody a unique ID, which means just give everybody a number. But the important thing was give everybody only one number. In other words, each person gets one number. So whether you're a big shot CEO or whether you're just someone working in the company, you get only one number. So it's very egalitarian in that sense. One number, one person. And the challenge we had was, how do you do that? How do you give 1 billion people a single, each one a unique number? And we said that the only way we can do that was through biometric deduplication, because they don't have paper, they don't have a root document, they don't have a birth certificate. And therefore, unless we should have a fairly robust way of establishing uniqueness, and we came to the conclusion that it had to be done biometrically. And the biometrics that we had were 10 fingerprints, the iris of both the eyes, and a photograph. And that we were convinced would be enough to establish uniqueness. Now, we didn't know this because nobody had done this before, so we were taking a punt that actually a billion people could be uniquely identified with this kind of biometrics. And then the other important thing which we did was we said, let's keep it simple. Because one of the things that happens in these kind of government projects is that the temptation to do everything. So, since you're going around, we are going to collect and issue numbers to 1 billion people. Everybody says, oh, you're going to go out and meet 1 billion people, so why don't you collect the blood group? Why don't you collect the caste? Why don't you collect the religion? Why don't you collect something else? And the most important thing is to say no. So our biggest contribution was we said no, no, no. We're only going to stick to basic information, name, address, date of birth, sex, and an email ID and phone number if you wish to reach out to us. And that was the fundamental concept of simplicity and minimalism. And our goal was that nobody should take more than 15 minutes to enroll into the system, because they said if you're going to get 1 billion people enrolled, we have to keep this simple. And at the end of the enrollment, they would get a 12-digit number, which is the Aadhaar number. Now, the 12-digit number is actually 11-digit. It's a random number with a 1-digit checksum. And so it's designed to go to 100 billion numbers. If you want the whole world on this, you're welcome to come. We can do it on the system. And we don't use numbers starting with 0 or 1. So we have 80 billion numbers. So idea was that no number should repeat itself. So we don't reuse numbers. So a lot of thinking went into this. But the most important thing was technologically was biometric deduplication. Now, to give you a scale of the problem, we designed this system to enroll 1.5 million people a day. In other words, at peak time, we had 35,000 enrollment stations across the length and breadth of the country, in the mountains, in the forests, next to the river, whatever, and all enrolling people at the rate of 1.5 million a day. Now, let's say that we have 500 million people in our database and 1 million new people enroll that day. That is 500 trillion computer matches we have to do to establish that it's not a duplicate person. So it's a massively complex parallel processing challenge, but we did that and this worked quite successfully. And this was how it panned out. We started in 2009. We rolled out our technology platform. Pramod and his colleagues worked really hard to build it in 14 months. We rolled it out in 2010. And by 2011, we had 100 million people who had been issued a number. And that went on steadily. By the time the government changed, we had 700 million people with the number, and the new government took it with equal zeal. And today, 1.23 billion people have been issued a unique number, and they are using it all the time. So this was the rate of growth. Now, the world has several billion user platforms. Google has 7. Facebook has 4. Microsoft has 2. Alipay has 1. WeChat has 1. This is the only one by a government. All the others are private. This is the only one which is not in the US and China. And this happened faster than any of them. So it's not a bad thing. Of course, if you have a government, you can get things done faster, right? Now, the use of this system is 2 big uses. One is called authentication, which is you use it to do an online verification of somebody's identity. And the other is KYC, which is you not only do authentication, then you get the photo ID and other details from the ID system and use that to provision a service, like opening a bank account, getting a mobile connection, buying an insurance policy, and so on. And authentication can be done biometrically. So I can authenticate somebody's ID with his fingerprint, iris, or photograph. Or you can do it demographically with his name and address. Or you can do it with an OTP, a one-time password, to the person's phone. And since inception, this has been used about 40 billion times, which means these billion people have used this system 40 billion times, and authentications have been about 33 billion. So clearly, this is operating at scale. This is about, not small stuff. And total Aadhaar issued is about 1.2 billion, 1.23 billion, and I just showed you those figures. But what's important is not just the fact that it did authentication and KYC, it was also linked to the banking system, which is why the NPCI was so important as a partner in this journey. And because you could open a bank account with the Aadhaar number, you then had the ID number in the banking system. And we have today, India has 647 million bank accounts which are linked to their ID number. That means there are 647 unique people who have a bank account linked to the ID number. And this is used for direct benefit transfer, G2P as you folks call it. And this system cumulatively since inception has done $32.4 billion worth of direct benefit transfer. It could be pensions, scholarships, LPG subsidies, whatever it is. This is the world's largest cash transfer program. And my friend here, Neeraj is here. Neeraj Mittal was at that time a joint secretary in the Department of Petroleum who did it for the petroleum sector. So he's right here. So this is the scale of the operation. Billion users, billions of authentications per month, $32 billion sent, and so many accounts connected. And why this is important is that this was the other big reason for this. It was to make the delivery of benefits much more efficient and much more to the genuine beneficiary. Before this stuff came along, India had built a whole welfare state which was very leaky because there were a lot of fakes and duplicates in the database, and therefore anywhere from 10 to 30, 40% of the money was not going to the beneficiaries. With this system, it goes directly to the beneficiary. It goes without any human intervention. It's straight through processing. It happens electronically into the bank account, and the person can go to any business correspondent in the country and withdraw his or her money. Just to give you a scale of that, today about 125 million people every month withdraw about 200 million transactions worth of money out of the banking system using this architecture by going to the neighborhood business correspondent. So this was really changed dramatically, the whole delivery of benefits. It's also used to authenticate to give you rights in the PDS and so on. So it's a big impact on the way things operate. This also is the reason why I talked about the fact that what would have taken 46 years got done in 7 or 8 years. The account penetration went up from 35% to 80%, but it also addressed many of the gaps. The gender gap was reduced, the employment gap was reduced, the education gap was reduced, the income gap was reduced. In other words, it's also about inclusion and getting more and more people into the system and reducing the gaps that exist in various categories. Now, this ID system is now fully rolled out and so on. Next thing I'll talk about is what we did on payments. Now, in the first instance, the direct benefit transfer was done, and that, as I said, is the world's largest G2B kind of program. But we then came to the issue of how do we make it easier for people to make payments from their phones and other ways. And this again was a project which we took up about 5-6 years back and said that people are looking for a whole new payment experience. This is actually an acronym, so you should be impressed by it. Mobile first, anytime, global, instant, convenient, assured, safe, and low-cost payments. That was our goal. And therefore, we came up with this thing called UPI. Now, this looks a bit geeky, but let me explain what's happening here. Essentially, this is a payment system from any bank account to any bank account in real time. So this is an instant payment system. So banks are source of funds. Money can go from bank A to bank B. So Unified Payment Interface, or UPI, is the payment rail on which these transactions happen. However, it is not limited to banks, and the architecture allows other players who collectively today are called as big tech to participate in payments. However, they are participating with the banks because the banks have banks are the guys who are regulated. The banks are the guys who take care of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, KYC. They provide counterparty risk. They provide deposit insurance, all that good stuff that we have in system. So the idea was that we want to leverage that strength of the banks, at the same time allow these innovative big tech or fintech firms to be participant in this. So we have a very unique architecture where we have about 5 or 6 of the big companies providing the consumer experience on the phone from their side. So the Google Pay is very popular. WhatsApp Pay, which is part of Facebook, is very popular. Samsung Pay is there. Walmart owns a company called PhonePe, which is very popular. Amazon Pay is there. Paytm is there. So there are many players. And this is the point, that it is about creating an approach which allows for competition and innovation. In other words, this is the only place in the world where there is enormous competition among all the people providing payments, so that it's a very healthy market, and it is based on a collaboration between the banks and the technology companies. So it's not the technology companies creating an alternative payment system. It's about technology companies participating in the payment system. So it's, instead of being, they're in the tent. They're not creating a second tent. They're in the tent. They're in the payment tent. And this is something which is very, very important, because India has been able to create a payment architecture which is open and competitive, and an architecture which allows the central bank and the banking system to be still in charge of payments, but still get the benefits of all these new kind of tech companies that have come. And you can use that for business to business, consumer to consumer, instant remittance. It's very, very flexible. You can pay, you can do person to person payments. You can pay a merchant using a QR code, all kinds of things. And this is something which has really taken the place by storm. Now, it is a fully interoperable payment system, which means that I can operate my application on Citibank and transmit to you, and your account can be in State Bank of India. It's like email. When you send email to somebody, you don't care which email server they're using, or whether they're using Yahoo or Hotmail or Google or whatever. And this is exactly like that. And on top of that, I can use an app from Google. My account can be in Citibank, and the person I send to has an account in State Bank of India, and he may be using an app from WhatsApp, and it works seamlessly. In fact, you don't even need to know what the other person is using. So this whole interoperable payment system, which allows you to operate, it's as simple as sending an email, but it's money, and fully within the regulatory norms of the central bank. So this is a very, very unique thing that exists. And in fact, WhatsApp is integrating with it. WhatsApp is currently, Google and PhonePe are the two biggest. They're about 35% each. But WhatsApp has done a beta with 1 million customers, and they are currently in discussions with the regulator to get some approvals on security and localization. And whenever they get those approvals, there are 400 million people in India on WhatsApp, and they're going to turn on the payments. And the good news is, it's not requiring some new money to be created. It is using the rupee itself. It's using existing currency and inside the banking system. So this has had a big impact on India's digital payments. In 2017-18, UPI was about 4% of digital payments, and in 2018-19, it's already gone up to 17%, because it's such a superior transacting experience. It's instant, it's cheap, it's convenient, all that good stuff. And recently, the last few months, the number of UPI transactions in India has already overtaken the number of debit card and credit card transactions. So a new payment system, which didn't exist 3 years back, is already bigger than traditional payment systems that have been around for many, many years. And the in October of 2016, this system had just been introduced. It was introduced about 6 months prior to that. It did about 100,000 transactions a month. Last month, it did 955 million transactions. So it's almost close to 1 billion transactions with a value of 23 billion US dollars. And that $23 billion in India's $2 trillion GDP is a lot of money. And therefore, it went from nothing to such a dominant thing because it's a completely radically different way of doing payments. So this is the second big thing. First was the ID and all the associated stuff I talked about. The second was bringing in a modern payment infrastructure, which is now being looked at closely by other countries because all other countries are dealing with the same issue of how do we make payments efficient, at the same time keep it open and competitive. The third thing is about data empowerment, because this is the other third big thing. Now, we are very familiar with the notion that data is becoming very, very strategic. We are having these discussions around the world today. Who does what with your data? The Europeans have passed the GDPR, trying to protect you from companies and others using your data. All these conversations has been about how do we make sure people are protected, how do we make sure people's privacy is secured, how do we make sure people's data is used. Nobody is asking the question, how do we create a way of people leveraging their own data? Can we think of a model where if there's so much data going around, and if that data is meaningful data which can be used for some good purpose, why can't we get the people to use that data? And therefore, our whole philosophy is that we must have an architecture or approach where every individual or every small business is able to take advantage of their own data to get something out of it. That could be to get a loan, or to get better health care, or to get a new job, or to improve their skills. So the use of your data to improve your life is a very important thing, and nobody has really done that. So this architecture actually allows you to empower people with their own data. And this is based on an entity called the account aggregator. Now this is how it works in the financial system, but it will be like that in other systems. So basically an account aggregator is like a company. It's a special company. It's a regulated company. So in India, the central bank gives licenses for people to be account aggregators, and they act on your behalf to marshal and organize your data for you. And they will work with different sources of data, which we call as financial information providers, and they give that data to different kinds of organizations that provide you services, which we call as financial information users. So let's say that you're a small business and you want to get some loan, you want to get credit. It's normally very difficult for a small business to get a loan from a bank because the bank doesn't know anything about you, and therefore they would rather give it to some big guy who doesn't give it back. And therefore, we need to have a way for the small guy to participate in the credit system. And therefore, a small business will go to his account aggregator, request for data from his bank or from the insurance company or from his tax platform, and that data flows encrypted, and you can give it to a lender who then decides to give you a loan based on the data, because data helps you to decide whether the person is credit worthy or not. And this entire thing is done online on the phone of the merchant. So this is dramatically reducing cost and providing a very efficient way. And this leads to democratization of credit. So instead of today, only about 8% of Indian small businesses get loans from the formal system. This will have a huge impact on that. And that's just one example of how data can be used by people for their own benefit. And that's what we call as data empowerment. And the important thing is that the data, the account aggregator is what we call as a data access fiduciary, which means they cannot read the data which is going through them. Because if they can read the data, then it creates other agency problems. They cannot resell the data, they cannot do advertising, nothing. They only act as a pass-through to take data from a provider to a user. So they only act as a traffic cop of the data. And so the whole design is pro-consumer, where consumer can use his own data. And this is a good example. So you have a small business, they have the returns, they get digital footprints, they consent to the data, give it to the lender, get credit, and so on. So this is something. Now this is not vaporware. This is actually being implemented today. The central bank has issued all the regulations. 7 entities have come forward to be the account aggregators. 1 got a license a couple of weeks back. 7 banks have already signed up for this, and so on. So this is all falling into place. And a year from now, when I'm back at the Masood's invitation, we'll give you more details about how it's going. Now, this also means that the lender gets the data directly from the bank or from the tax system. It's tamper-proof, it's signed and sent. It's all happening in real time at very low cost. So you can imagine, and you can do this at the scale of 1 billion people. This is not just for a few people, it's for 1 billion people that you can do this. And the data and then AI applied to the data will not only enable you to give credit quickly to the people who deserve it, you can use the same to figure out who is a potential fraud, and therefore you can streamline the whole business of credit at scale. So this is what we call as a data democracy, that instead of data being used to sell things to you, data is being used to empower you. So it's a complete inversion of how we think about data, and this is the first place in the world where there is such a architecture working. So 3 things, 3 big ideas the last decade: providing access to 1.2 billion people with identity, keeping them in the system with a brand new payment system, and then creating an empowerment architecture which allows people to use their own data. Currently, the data empowerment is being done in financial systems, but the same architecture can be done for healthcare, for example. So you can just duplicate this thing. And this, we think, will create a flywheel where people open bank accounts, then they get DBT money into the accounts, they get remittance into the accounts, they use that money, do cashless payments, that creates a digital footprint, and they use that digital footprint to get access to credit and so on. The whole idea is to create a flywheel of digital energy in the system. So the whole idea here is thinking about this as building platforms. It's not about building individual point solutions. It's about building platforms which over years start interacting with each other to create new capability, what you can call as combinatorial innovation. All these things start working with each other. And that's exactly how the internet has become so successful, because while the basic internet architecture is the same, we know that you can have Google or Wikipedia or a government service or Amazon all working on the same platform. And that's how you think about it. And our view is that these things that we have built in India, which we call it the India stack, can be used for DBT, bank accounts, health insurance. In fact, the current health insurance architecture also uses this, skilling, lending. So suddenly, you have built layers and layers of capability on which you can build a lot of things. And that's how we need to think about national infrastructure. And it's combining regulated players and unregulated players so that you get the best of both worlds. You get the strength and robustness of the banks, but you get the consumer experience of Google or Facebook. So you get both. And that's what this does. And no one else has done this kind of plan. And so otherwise what is happening today is that in the old model you had a closed system, banks, clearinghouses, central bank, and that's part of the reason that in many parts of the world they don't really offer some of these services. Or you have a big tech saying we'll do everything ourselves and use our money and stuff like that. But this is something which is like a golden mean, which combines the power of the banking system with the reach and distribution and consumer experience of the big techs. So we think that taking this approach, it's not regulation versus innovation, it's regulation and innovation. It's not privacy versus personalization, it's privacy and personalization. And it's not ease of use versus fraud prevention, it's both. So able to sort of square the circle on many of these things. I'll just add a quick plug for an organization called iSpirit, which I'm a member, Pramod is a member, Tanuj has gone off somewhere. Basically, these are all volunteers who are trying to say that you can get a leapfrog in a country using technology. And so we work sort of pro bono with the system to create or help. I mean, the system, government owns all these systems, but we help to create it and to evangelize it. And it's really what we call as paying forward. So it's volunteer-driven social production. And having such people in the country is an important reason why this has worked, because you have people who can do all this stuff. So this is something you can do anywhere. So it's not, I know we took 10 years and all that, but fundamentally, anywhere you can do this. Start small, start anywhere, start today. But this is a way to think about development using technology. Thank you very much.
Well, that was fantastic, and it's going to get even better because now we're going to have a panel discussion. If I can invite the other panelists up, please. Amani Abu Zaid is the Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union Commission, and she has had a career that I would not say is haphazard, but is very impressive, from being a telecommunications engineer with an MBA in project management, public administration, and also, it's a nice thing, she has a degree in arts from the Sorbonne. She's worked before the AUC in a bunch of IFEs in leadership roles. And then Christian, who is a sort of practitioner, Christian Wolf-Sondergaard, who's the Senior VP and head of the Group of Public and Regulatory Affairs at Telenor. So he brings a policy background from Denmark and also a lot of experience in one of the companies, the telecoms company Telenor, which has been very important in working with digital transformation in developing countries in Asia, perhaps a bit more than in South Asia. So I want to start, Commissioner, if I may, with you. We've had this exciting presentation, which then ended up saying, yeah, everybody can do it. Just get going, forget about the 10 years. And I wanted to ask you what you see as the lessons from India. Are there lessons from India's experience for Africa as you've been promoting the digital transformation there? Or is it really fundamentally different in important ways? And there are many other things that are springing into my mind, but let me just start there with you, please.
First of all, this is impressive, and it's. I'm not saying this just because we are here. We know it is impressive, and we knew before coming to this session that India has done fantastically well. For us in Africa, I mean, as far as the African Union is concerned, we have the mission at the African Union of integrating the continent socially and economically. So the constant, if you will, obsession for us is how to make 55 countries work together. That is what is, keeping us busy all the time and sometimes awake at night. So how to make this continent work together as one. Remember, in the case of India, it's almost the same number of population, 1.2, 1.2. But here is one country, and I'm talking about 55 countries. So that's already a challenge. So 55 countries with 55 governments, with 55 policies, with 55 levels of development. So how to bring everybody to a level together and almost at the same time. So here we're having a completely different, I mean, you talk about the challenge, here is to start with. There is also an assumption when we talked about India, that the infrastructure exists. The infrastructure does not necessarily exist in Africa. We talked about only a third of the population of the continent being connected. So that's already a huge challenge. And the level of investments just to have the infrastructure is huge. I mean, earlier this afternoon, we were having another panel with other partners trying to see how to get just the infrastructure, taking place. So this is also an important element. Of course, we have a continent that is moving extremely fast. I mean, I'm saying this, because you asked about the challenges.
Yes.
Africa, while it's still only the third of the population being connected, it's also the fastest in terms of growth, of connection to the internet. So we want to keep that growing, but we want to keep it going in a way that that is inclusive, because again, inclusion here means urban-rural. Rural is inclusion means women and men, young and old, skills which exist here does not exist there, and so on and so forth. And inclusion also countries that are in the center of Africa that are not connected or landlocked, and others, at the peripherals who have better chances of getting connections. So the image gets more complex in Africa, but the great lesson that we are learning from India on the digital ID, from digital Estonia and digitalization in general. I'm sure you're going to talk to us about your experience, but the lesson that we are taking is that it is doable. We can do it. The challenges are enormous, but others Estonia started when they said there was nothing. They started by a telephone, Finland was selling them, giving them a gift, central téléphonique, a telephone exchange. And then they said, no, we're not going to take that. Let us just, create something for ourselves. India is starting, they reflect for themselves. And that's very important, because on the continent, that's also what we are doing. We are adopting the technology here. I'm not talking about the ID per se. Africa is creating solutions for everyday problems using the technology. And we're creating these solutions by Africans. Our own youth are creating these solutions for us. I mean, this whole thing, just remember the large part where it was talking about, the presentation was talking about payment. Just the notion of mobile payment was invented in Africa. So just that, to start with. And now it becomes, we talk about it as if it's, it's the norm. It was not the norm. But the opportunities are huge. The challenges are huge. This morning, we were talking specifically about the ID. I raised a number of challenges as well, like the refugees. I talked about the refugees and IDPs. A number of African ministers were there, and those of you who were there could have just listened. They have security issues, and I'm not talking about just cybersecurity. I'm talking about physical security, about terrorism, about refugees from other countries. There are other issues also that constitute, how would I say, a challenge, but are also a resistance. Because even as citizens, we're still, and this is where we need to learn. There is the perception, they're doing this as a means of surveillance. They want to know where we're going. How much we're paying. And remember the informal sector, which is very large on the continent, talk about 70% in some countries, 50% in others. They say, so this is why they want us to pay taxes. There are suspicions and the resistance. And again, what we keep saying, please. And I like very much the third pillar or the third layer of, we need to talk more about the benefits, not just about
the risks.
The risks, or that a citizen is basically suspicious until proven innocent, but rather that we are rolling out or trying to roll out digital transformation because it brings fundamental benefits to everybody, and our aim and purpose is inclusion and for that improving the quality of living, and that's why we are doing it. And then, of course, it will help curb many of the problems, including corruption, red tape, so on.
So, Christian, maybe I can ask you a narrow, more specific question, which is about well, maybe not even the challenges, but also the advantages in providing that infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure. What is it that makes a company like yours function well as you've managed to do in a number of developing countries? And what would be your advice for the 55 countries that the Commissioner has to deal with, but also with others?
Well, first of all, just picking up on the positive note coming out, there's enormous potential, right? I think we've seen that from when we entered Myanmar, seeing how a country that came out of 50 years of totalitarianism to actually opening up, and all of a sudden 60% having smartphones, using the internet at the same rate as people do in central Bangkok, right? So incredible leapfrogging, and I think that's where the potential is with technology. And even though we talk about developing countries, I actually think in many aspects there is a benefit by being a developing country, because you can skip all the kind of technology generations that is bogging down this country and many countries in Europe. So you can go mobile first. You can innovate and get mobile payment, and all of a sudden bank large portions of the population, even though you don't have the same infrastructure that you have in India, where you give an ID to 1.2 billion people. So I think that is the opportunity side. I think when it comes, the one common denominator that we've been seeing across our markets, which is no big surprise coming from a mobile company, is the mobile telephone, and especially the smartphone. So it gives incredible opportunities, and kind of this connectivity inclusion leads to financial inclusion, leads to social inclusion. So that's the trajectory that we see across the markets. So that all entails that you need to have good connectivity. Right? And coming back to your question, so what can be done there? And it's basically seeing the industry, from the government side, seeing the industry as a partner. So massive investments in infrastructure are required. So it's not easy building out infrastructure. And if we want to connect everyone, the connectivity also needs to be everywhere. And that entails a significant cost. Right? So it's looking at this over the long term, having a partnership with the government, saying, okay, how do we enable continuous investment so that we keep up with where the technology is heading, and making sure that all of the population is benefiting from the technology.
Right. And I do remember when I worked at Google, going to South Africa, and there were some super smart developers and so on, but there were a massive problem of the expense of connectivity, and not even just can you get connectivity deep into the DRC, but can you get it at a price that people can use, and obviously that requires a change in the government regulation. I want to ask all of you maybe about, and ending up with Nilekani's experience, that it was mentioned beforehand that women appear to have far less access, which is kind of a depressing thing, obviously, but especially because there seems to be so much new chance from leapfrogging and all the rest of it, and in the end, I guess societies don't change just because technology has changed, or it's a more complex thing. So in your experience in Pakistan, are there useful ways that the technology can be married to with other changes, perhaps, to make this a less gendered process?
So I think there are different ways of going about this. So one thing is identity. We've seen that from India. We see that other places as well. So one of the things that we do is we have partnered up with UNICEF in order to enable health workers in the rural areas to use a mobile platform in order to register births. And it starts there, right? So, having an identity, as you rightly pointed out, is kind of the gateway to other things. So if you live a life of being unregistered, it's immensely more difficult to be included and being kind of on par. The other thing is there are things that can be done from the government side as well. So again, in Pakistan, there's one of the big problems distributing grants from the government, especially to women, was that the funds were intercepted, either by third parties or by kind of the men in the family. The problem with that being is that if you give a woman of a family funds, 90% of that benefits the family, whereas it's only 30 to 40% if it's a man. That's a whole completely different discussion. but
It's true, though.
It's true. Although in my household it's the other way around. But that's a different thing. But with women having an identity, having a mobile phone, you're all of a sudden able to get the funds directly to the intended person, right? So, and there you start seeing also an empowerment that once you have the mobile, you start getting funds rolling in through that, it leads to other things, and you can build on that. Then you can build on those programs in order to create business opportunities, help women start small businesses, give them microloans, and so on and so forth. So it is really, if you start the right place, you can get the ball rolling on this.
It's very interesting that you say it really starts with identity, which is, of course, exactly how you started in India. But maybe I can ask you if there are these suspicions and concerns about, in various different African countries, about, this is about the government is trying to surveil me, or I don't really want to. Is there a resistance, or how could a resistance to identity and identification be overcome?
No, but I will get to that point, but I
Yes.
wanted to also address the issue of divide.
Yes.
And I do not wish for us, to disassociate the issue of discrimination or divide from, digital divide,
Yes.
from the issue of discrimination in general, because it's just, this is just a technology that came, but the discrimination existed before as well. So it's not like, however, because this technology is moving so fast, and it's getting, and the changes are so deep and fundamental, the risk of the divide gets, also
Entrenched,
and it widens, the pace is accelerating. So there is a cultural or tradition or culture, but the divide also, we have to talk about urban-rural. Remember, again, Africa is mainly rural, and it is extremely costly already in the city to get connected to the internet. We're paying in Africa 3-4 times more expensive than in, say, Europe, with our own, the level of income that we're having. So we're paying already far more than any of you, in Europe, in the city. Now, you want the people in rural areas, not only they don't have the internet, and when they have it, to pay as much as those in urban areas, whereas they constitute the majority of the population. Of course, this is another very deep discrimination divide that we need to address. And here we are trying to talk also to the operators to find a way to lower the cost for rural areas. Or this, we across the continent, we're thinking of many innovative ways actually to address the issue of connectivity in rural areas. This afternoon we mentioned the post offices, the balloons in Kenya and others. Again, because it is the majority of the population, and already there's an income gap between urban and rural, we need to address that. Now, your question about the ID, what was it? I seem to have forgotten that.
The question was about, are there ways that that the identity, the
Yes.
resistance to identity can be overcome if that is a really gating issue for
No,
some of the...
it is being overcome, and again, I did mention that we are 55 countries, and many of our countries are already rolling out programs for digital ID, and we've heard many. Just more, there was like 4 or 5 of them. I mean, each coming with a different experience and different challenges. Now, the additional layer, as the African Union is concerned, which is challenge how to make all these initiatives work to interoperable and work together across borders. That's really another layer of challenges. And I see Mardi Amin is here, is from the UNECA and African Union, UNECA, and other agencies. We're working together. He is working on the digital ID program. He can talk more about that. But again, this is another layer that we are adding. Now, unless we really incentivize our people and our governments, and now that on the continent, we have a golden opportunity for this interoperability across borders. Last year, we launched the African Free Trade Area, the Continental Free Trade Area, the largest in the world. So, and it did enter into force in last July. Now governments are being aware of 2 things. 1, how do we move goods and people across borders? 2, how do we pay and identify the people who are going to do trade across borders? So yeah, now digital ID becomes a top issue on the continent, so which is good because we wanted them to, all governments to be aware that there's this is why we kept saying you need an identifier, a digital identifier, unique identifier. 2, you need to make it, interoperable across borders, because otherwise you will not be able to trade. And by the same token, you need transport. I'm also the commissioner for infrastructure. And talk about infrastructure, again, I stress again and again and again, because it's fundamentally important. More than half of the population of the continent does not have access to energy. And none of this would work without energy. And the beauty of the digital transformation or digitalization, that it's a virtuous circle. We have now mini grids that, solar panels that pay with a pay-as-you-go, and in rural areas. And they do the solar panel pay-as-you-go. They even, sell to the neighbors, the excess energy. So it becomes, you're creating another, virtuous. Yes. So it's a good thing. But this is a very small scale, but remember, you need for the fiber optics, you need energy. For your mobile, you need energy. For this, you need energy. So we need to look at the whole thing, not just the technology and the regulator. That's, of course, we have to look at it. But we do have an infrastructural challenge on the continent beyond the digital one. Even the basic things like electricity does not exist for more than half of the population, which is another massive investment that will be needed, that is needed for that, for which we are also working. We have a program for a large one, and projects are being rolled out, but it's a big
It's
task.
very tricky. Nilekani, I'd like to, Nandan, I'd like to turn to you to, after hearing some of these challenges, if you have particular advice, and if you think, yes, there are some special things about India being one country, and I know there are many different sort of areas and income levels and so on across that country, also a rural-urban divide in India, but have one country, one central bank, the ability to have one ID system and to have the UPI, which was so important. So I'd like you to think about what specific ways could be overcome in Africa, but also in other countries that don't have that size and expertise.
Certainly, I think the complexity of Africa, of the fact that there are 55 independent sovereign countries, definitely makes it far more complicated. But I think we have to give them enormous credit, because in the rest of the world, while people are exiting common markets, including in your country.
I'm an American, I just want to let you know.
Let's not even.
Where people are exiting common markets, the fact that the African nations have come together
Yes.
to create a continental free trade zone is an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah.
And I don't think the world has fully appreciated what has happened here. And so I think, but the good thing is, having done that, I think we need to take advantage of that, because the whole idea of creating a CFTA was to get scale benefits, 1.2 billion consumers, more trade, more commerce, more movement. And I think providing a digital infrastructure for that will greatly reduce the friction for that. And I think that's it's there. I know that the leaders of the African leaders are aware of this. And therefore, this is sort of a discontinuity that we have, that they've come together to form the CFTA. I think we can leverage that to create continent-wide platforms. There's nothing to stop us from having a single African ID, which, that no way impinges on the sovereignty and nationality of individual countries. This is like more something for you to they already have an African passport.
Yeah.
She was showing her African passport. So they can have an African digital ID, and then we can have an African interoperable payment system. And sometimes those can actually drive the integration that they want. So I see this as a great opportunity to bring all these ideas in.
Well, that's a great idea. I want to allow just for a couple of questions. We don't have.
There's a lady over there.
Yeah, we don't. And there is a microphone that is coming. I'm going to gather a few questions given the time.
While you gather the questions, you mentioned art, but we are also digitizing our art. Remember, culture, we have lots of intangible cultural heritage and art, and there are lots of efforts across the continent to
with
capture
Google
to digitize.
or beyond that?
Sorry?
Well, I know Google was doing a lot of that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussions. Thank you very much to the panelists. We learned a lot. My name is Ngozi Ebuna, and I work with the West African Monetary Institute. The West African Monetary Institute is the Institute of the West African Monetary Zone. Just a few questions, and then I'll make a comment. For the Indian experience, can you just tell us the implications of the digital ID system for tax administration and fiscal operations? We didn't hear anything about that. And then also the idea of the account aggregator is very interesting. I'm sure it has created another layer of employment for Indians. But I'm wondering why you had to keep it to only 7 aggregators. And then why is it that you're allowing only banks to apply for that license? Wouldn't it be better for other private sector operators to deal with that? Then the other question, the other comment I have for you is, please could you explain to us how you went through cultural and religious biases before you could get those millions of people to register with you? But finally, just one moment, just to support the commissioner from my zone, that yes, in the area of payment system infrastructure, the AfriExim is doing a lot to make sure that we have payment system infrastructure that is integrated, and they are using my zone as a pilot, and it's going live at the end of November 2019. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then here.
Thank you so much for very interesting discussions. I think it would be very appreciated to learn some the personal data protections from both technological perspective and the legal system, because as the India speakers introduced, the huge personal data is kept in digital financial platform. Of course, this is a huge benefit provided to digital platform companies and also to the end consumers. But I think that also can cause huge financial risks, because if the personal data if personal data on this platform by hackers, so they can use personal data to build a fraud account, can cause money laundering or some criminal financial activities. And also, if the third part set a mini program on that financial platform, so that can misguide all these consumers to cause social political problems. Like I think 2016, they compared analytical company to access to Facebook, the personal data. And also, I think the huge financial risk also caused for both government and the financial digital platform. So my question focus from technical perspective and from legal, personal data protection. We would like to learn some benefit or experience from India. That's my first question. And second question, of course.
There are many people want to ask questions, and we only have a couple of minutes.
Okay, so very similar. How to relate it to governance this digital financial market, to stimulate competition and innovation to build a more secure the digital platform. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a lady in the front row here, and
now we don't remember the questions.
yeah, I'm going to stop after this one. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. So Julia Robbins, I'm from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. I see that there's a lot of value in all this data in the identities, as well as a huge cost rolling out these systems. Do you feel that there's any role for private companies to facilitate collecting and creating these identities while still maintaining all the social safeguards that would need to be kept in place?
Right. So maybe I can ask you to respond a little bit about the private companies and on the questions that kind of boil down to a bit about cybersecurity and hacking and so on. Yeah. Yep.
So the role of private companies, I think the lessons learned so far is that you need to be very clear on the individual roles in the different projects, right? So yes, private companies can do a lot, but there are things that should not be done by private companies. And I think when it comes to this topic, kind of the government ownership of this is extremely important. So it's a yes with a caveat, right?
Thanks. Yeah. And while I want to ask each of you to roll in your final, somebody yesterday did this well, roll in your kind of final comments to the response. So let me warn you of that, Christian. This is your last chance.
Last chance.
That's a good way to end, perhaps.
I could take a hint anyway. I'll still say a couple of things, right? On data protection, I think that is one of the things again where you need clear roles also when it comes to what is the government role. I don't necessarily think that when it comes to unique national IDs is something that should be kind of stored and kept by private companies. This is a government role and responsibility. However, there are massive opportunities when it comes to what can this ID be used for, right? So both kind of the very singular use of the ID to create different business opportunities. The other is kind of the data aggregator that you're talking about in India, which I'm very curious about because I also see some flip sides to that one, right? But my final comment would then be receptive to the role of private companies and don't overlook the role of connectivity, which needs to be kind of also supported over the long term. So the connectivity that we have today is not sufficient tomorrow, 5 and 10 years down the road. And that will require continuous investments and an enabling environment also provided by governments.
Yeah, thanks very much. And
I wanted to talk to the point regarding, and thank you, my sister, for and Afrexim Bank is working within the AFC, the Continental Free Trade Area program. We have several components, and each has a player or a partner. So Afrexim Bank is one of the main partners when for this the payment, the digital payment. Now, I wanted to talk about cybersecurity and private and personal data protection. At the African Union, we have a convention for cybersecurity and personal data protection since several years actually, and there were and still is only 3 or 4 countries who ratified it. Because they were not aware, you know, or again, that this is important until Cambridge Analytica happened. And when it happened, everybody realized, not just in Africa, but it was very relevant to Africa. I remember that year, 2 countries in Africa were about to go to civil war because of this. 2 countries in Africa, and big countries. They were about to go to civil war because the data were used to influence voters. So this is how serious it is. So not just for individuals, for nations, it has very serious implications. So then, and also the same year, the GDPR started to come out, and then African nations were, you know, because we're doing business with Europe, they signed the GDPR. Now we asked, so what about the African one? So now we are seeing, you know, a comeback, and we are sensitizing, working with our countries to sensitize, to capacitate, to create, you know, the national capacity to for cybersecurity. It's very important. And I will end. You asked, you know, just to end. I will quote the president of Estonia when I met her. I mean, she was saying a fantastic example. Remember, Estonia, they went very far when it comes to digitalization, but they were also at some point they had a very serious cyber attack, that almost brought the country to a halt. But she said something that really very wise. She said, motor cars, I mean, the cars were invented. Everybody, we cannot now, I mean, just, you know, not drive or not use a car. But along with that, we developed laws and traffic lights and awareness. So accidents will happen, but you keep, you know, improving your
safety record.
Exactly. So we need to continue, you know, working on the cybersecurity, but cannot stop us and should not stop us from driving a car, and it should not stop us neither from really working hard on digitizing.
Thank you very much.
No, I think obviously you need to, when you're doing digitization at this scale and with this kind of, you have to look at privacy issues, you have to look at security, you have to be aware that you are potentially going to be attacked from all over the world. So, you know, I think this is all part and parcel of what has to be done, and the design of these things has to be done with that in mind. And that's by and large happening in all the systems we described. I think on the legal front, in the same 10 years, India went through some seminal legal issues. First of all, there was a whole debate about whether Indians have a fundamental right to privacy at all. And for this, we had to have a 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court, which said that, yes, Indians have a fundamental right to privacy. And that after that, an Aadhaar law was passed. So there's a law which governs the use of Aadhaar. And of course, on the banking side, there are many laws on confidentiality, anti-money laundering, and so on. And finally, there is a data protection and privacy law, which is now draft and is come out, and hopefully will go through our legislative process in the next couple of years. So the legal infrastructure and the tech infrastructure is being laid. I think on the question of you know, resistance, you know, one of the things, as I mentioned early, was that we wanted to keep the data minimal, because first of all, every field you add, that's 1 billion times how to collect it. So, you know, better to keep it simple. And second, the less data you have, the less resistance you have. So that's why we kept the data absolutely minimal: name, address, date of birth, and sex, and email ID and phone number if you wish. And so minimalism, I think, is very important, because all we wanted to do was an ID that said that John is John or Abdul is Abdul. We don't want to go beyond that. So why collect all that information? So I think minimalism is very, very important, and that also prevented sort of stepping on somebody else's toes. Because if we collect the blood group, then the health ministry gets upset. You know, if we collect something else, somebody else gets upset. So, you know, forget all that. Keep it simple. So I think that's been an important part. But I think the important thing, I'll end by saying that I think technology has great promise in development, but doing it properly, doing it thoughtfully, doing it strategically thinking of it as platforms that can start combining and creating innovation is very important to get the full bang for the buck.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the panel. You're all fantastic. I think it was a great discussion, and may I invite you all to come to a reception that is in the back, and then I'm sure there will be, all of you will be in great demand from others, but yeah, sure, a group photo. We have a photographer. Well, Masood, we actually